By the evening of the 25th, Maruyama's troops were in position south of Henderson Field. The Marine line was a few yards east of Vicious Ridge. Chesty Puller's men waited in the rain for the attack they knew was coming. On the Marines' left was a battalion of the 164th Infantry that had just arrived on the island and was immediately rushed into the line. The torrential downpour ceased for a few hours and allowed Maruyama time to organize the attack. At 23, just as the attack was ready to jump off, the rains came again. Nevertheless, a few thousand troops swarmed out of the jungle shouting, "Banzai and Marine, you die," so many that the sodden ground shook beneath their feet. The first wave got hung up on the barbed wire as the Marines poured machine gun, rifle, mortar, artillery and canister fire into the advancing ranks. One enemy company opened a gap in the Marine line and broke through. The Japanese horde swarmed toward this gap, but Puller's men slammed it shut in their face. Marine machine gunners fired so many rounds that the cooling water in their jackets evaporated. Marines urinated in the jackets to replace the liquid and kept on firing. The massacre was horrible, and the enemy filtered back to their lines. At 1:30 they attacked again. The slopes of the ridge were slick from the rain and the blood of dead Japanese troops, but the attackers came on. Holes were punched in the Marine lines, and General Geiger, filling in for the absent Vandergrift, committed his reserve and restored the line. The Sendai withdrew into the jungle only to come once more at 3:30. This time the 164th Infantry swung into action. Company after company of Japanese were cut down by automatic rifle fire. Artillery shells slammed into the advancing wave. By 7 o'clock it was all over. Over 1,000 of Maruyama's crack troops lay dead in front of the Marine lines. But the battle was not over by a long shot. During the day, Japanese planes attacked the Marine positions. Many of them were destroyed by their Cactus Air Force, but the air raid hampered Puller's efforts to bring supplies forward. Nevertheless, Geiger did manage to send another battalion of the 164th Infantry into line. At the same time, Puller shortened his line, for he knew full well that the Japanese would return. Late that night, Puller's predictions were borne out. The remaining troops of Maruyama's command surged out of the jungle, screaming obscenities. Artillery and mortar fire blasted the attackers before they even reached the line. Each charge met with a vicious repulse thanks to the deadly fire of the Americans, particularly that of the 164th Infantry, the troops of which, at long last, were given the opportunity to prove their mettle in action. Maruyama continued to order troops forward into the hail of death. Eventually, the attacks petered out through sheer lack of manpower. By morning, Maruyama's attack was smashed. According to Jack Coggins, the Sendai division was wrecked, with half its officers annihilated or wounded. 2,500 of Japan's finest troops lay dead on the battlefield. Some survivors retreated back along the Maruyama Trail. Others, their spirit broken, made their way east towards Taivu Point. During the retreat, many of the wounded perished, bringing the death toll to well over 3,000. While the Sendai were battering themselves against the American line south of Henderson Field, Colonel Oka finally launched his attack against the southern part of the Matanikau position. This attack should have been made in concert with Shimeyoshi's effort on the 23rd, but just as was true during Kawaguchi's ill-fated offensive, Oka was unable to move his troops into position in time. They came swarming out of the jungle at 21:30 and drove the Americans back. There was bitter hand-to-hand fighting as defender wrestled with attacker. Eventually, the Japanese wave receded only to regroup. At 3 o'clock, Oka sent another wave against the Marines. Japanese troops occupied abandoned foxholes and turned their guns on the Marines' flank. Marines went along the ridge, eliminating each one of these positions with grenades and rifle fire. Around dawn, the Japanese began to withdraw. The Marines counterattacked and drove the remnants of Oka's force back into the jungle, Ugal for Guadalcanal. On the 16th of October, Admiral Nimitz decided that Gormley's defeatist attitude was detrimental to the campaign. Gormley had been overly cautious and unwilling to risk ships to supply and reinforce Vandergrift's beleaguered troops. He was relieved from his command and replaced by an aggressive fighter. Admiral William Bull Halsey immediately summoned Vandergrift to Noumea so that he might gain first-hand knowledge of what was needed to achieve final victory. The meeting took place during the height of Maruyama's attack. When apprised of Vandergrift's needs, Halsey replied that he would commit everything at his disposal to the campaign on Guadalcanal. But the admiral lacked carriers. While the battle for the airstrip was in full sway, another of the major naval battles for Guadalcanal took place. On the 25th of October and 26, during the Battle of Santa Cruz, the Navy lost the carrier Hornet, while the Enterprise was badly damaged, necessitating extensive repairs. The Japanese cost was damage to 2 carriers. Despite the heavy toll of Santa Cruz, the initiative on Guadalcanal appeared to have swung over to the Americans. Vandergrift was anxious to follow up his success and catch the enemy off balance by taking the offensive. On the 31st, engineers constructed a bridge across the Matanikau. The next morning, Marines and soldiers crossed the river and headed for Point Cruz. At the same time, the 7th of Marines and 164th Infantry moved eastward from Lunga towards Coley Point. By the 2nd of November, the attackers were dug in along the Nalimbu River. It took 4 days' worth of bitter fighting, but on the 7th, Coley Point was cleared by the GIs. The attack in the west was even more successful. Vandergrift's men beat off a heavy enemy attack on the 4th and pushed the Japanese out of Point Cruz. The advance continued against little opposition. On the 10th, the 2nd of Marines and 164th Infantry launched an attack toward Cocumbona from Point Cruz. Vandergrift called this attack off the next day when reports were received that the enemy was preparing still another attack against the Lunga perimeter. On the 6th, the 2nd Raider Battalion under Colonel Evans Carlson made a landing east of Taivu Point and started overland. The Raiders made an epic month-long march through the jungle, encountering scattered enemy units retreating toward Mount Austin. They also managed to destroy a handful of Japanese supply dumps. By the time Carlson's men entered the Lunga perimeter on the 4th of December, they had annihilated over 450 of the enemy at a cost to themselves of 16 dead and 18 wounded. Reinforcements for both sides continued to pour into the island. Between the 2nd and 11th of November, 3,500 men of the Japanese 38th Division were safely landed by the Tokyo Express. On the 4th, the 8th Marines arrived to reinforce Vandergrift. On the 12th, over 6,000 men of General Alexander Patch's American Division and most of their equipment were safely brought ashore at Lunga Point. The Japanese were pulling out all the stops. Their plan called for a fleet of cruisers and battleships to sail into Iron Bottom Sound and bombard the American positions prior to another major ground attack. A similar force, escorting 11 transports crammed with troops, was to link up with the first force and repeat the bombardment the following night. The ensuing twin battles, occurring on 2 separate nights between the 12th of November and 14, marked the turning point in the naval phase of the battle for Guadalcanal. The first and second naval battles of Guadalcanal cost the Japanese 2 battleships, 3 destroyers, and extensive damage to a number of cruisers and destroyers. In addition, Henderson's pilots sunk 7 of the 11 Japanese transports. Those troops that did manage to land safely lacked weapons. Furthermore, all of their supplies and equipment had been lost at sea. This action broke the back of the proposed Japanese land attack. The Americans paid dearly for their victory at sea with 2 cruisers, 7 destroyers, and the lives of Admirals Callahan and Scott. But after that, the Japanese Navy never again sailed into Iron Bottom Sound at will to bombard American positions. A few days after the naval battle, Halsey made a visit to the island. He could readily see that the Marines were in a bad way. Disease had taken a heavier toll than the enemy. Virtually 75% of the troops suffered from either malaria or another disease. They all suffered from exhaustion. Perhaps the most exhausted of all was Vandergrift. Halsey decided right then that the 1st Marine Division would have to be replaced by fresh troops, lest the stalemate continue. Halsey told General Alexander Patch, commander of the American Division, to plan on assuming command of all troops on Guadalcanal as soon as it was feasible. The Admiral promised Patch fresh troops. The 2nd Marine Division was ordered to Guadalcanal, as was General J. Lawton Collins' 25th Division, which was en route to Hawaii. In the interim, the Tokyo Express continued to run. By now, the dominance of American air power made these supply runs precarious at best. The only time Japanese ships could safely approach the island was under cover of darkness. By daylight, they had to be far back up the slot. This precluded the use of slow-moving transports. Tanaka seized upon the idea of utilizing high-speed destroyers to drop drums of supplies offshore of the Japanese positions. The troops could then swim out and retrieve the drums. Once the loads were dumped overboard, the destroyers could hightail it back to the Shortlands. Although the concept rated merit, the strong currents around Guadalcanal prevented many of the drums from being retrieved. The wily admiral also had one more deadly surprise in store for American naval forces. On the night of the 30th of November, during one of the supply runs, Tanaka's destroyer men ambushed an American force under Admiral Carleton Wright. At the Battle of Tassafaronga, Wright lost the cruiser Northampton. 3 other cruisers were heavily damaged by torpedoes. Tanaka lost 1 destroyer. On December 9th, Patch officially relieved Vandergrift. The Marine General had truly earned the high honor bestowed upon him, the Congressional Medal of Honor. For 4 months he had brilliantly led his men in action. Abandoned by the Navy, without prospect of resupply or reinforcement, Vandergrift's 1st Marine Division clung precariously to Guadalcanal. The Marines beat back every effort by some of Japan's finest shock troops, while enduring almost daily attack by enemy aircraft and nightly attack from Japanese warships. Red Mike, Edson, and 2 enlisted men also earned the Medal of Honor. Throughout the month of December, a steady flow of fresh troops arrived on Guadalcanal. These troops began to relieve the men of the 1st Marine Division. The Marines came trudging back from the front lines with weary, sunken, bloodshot eyes and hollowed cheeks ravaged by disease. They rested in the rear until late in the month. Then the gallant 1st Marine Division boarded transports and left Guadalcanal behind for good. In Dye Cemetery at Lunga Point, one of them had scrawled this epitaph: "And when he gets to heaven, to St. Peter he will tell, 'One more Marine reporting, sir. I have served my time in hell.'" There were now, besides Vandergrift's spent force, 3 fresh divisions on the island: the Americal, the 25th Army, and the 2nd Marine. A corps headquarters, the 14th, was established with Patch as commander. Patch began making plans for an all-out offensive in January designed to throw out the Japanese once and for all. In the meantime, he launched a small-scale attack against Japanese-held positions on Mount Austin. On the 12th of December, General Collins preceded his division to the island and was immediately impressed by the tall, thin general whom he considered full of nervous energy and drive. He later recalled, "As we entered his underground command post, located in direct prolongation of the runway of Henderson Field, an air raid alert sounded. Sandy said, 'Don't let that disturb you. Happens all the time,' and nonchalantly proceeded with his briefing. Halsey's orders to Patch were simple and to the point. Eliminate all Japanese forces. Mount Austin was the highest point in the low mountain range at the center of the island. Defenders of the mountain could observe all movement on the island and report it to their own headquarters. The Japanese recognized the vital importance of this position relatively early in the game and had built a strong defensive system of fortified bunkers on the slopes. Elimination of this strong point was Patch's first objective. On the 16th of December, Patch ordered the 132nd Infantry Regiment to capture the Japanese positions on Mount Austin. The following morning, the 132nd began to ascend the slopes of the mountain. Hampered by the jungle terrain and stiff Japanese resistance, they were shortly stopped by a withering fire from the main enemy strongpoint known as Gifu. The Japanese were experts in the construction of defensive positions, and the ones on Mount Austin were a tribute to their ability. Log-covered bunkers were constructed with dug-in supporting machine gun positions. The entire system was honeycombed with trenches through which the enemy communicated with and reinforced his outposts. The positions were impervious to all but a direct hit with heavy artillery. The Americans attacked Gifu without let-up for 2 weeks. At the end of that time, the Japanese positions remained intact, and the 132nd had to pause and regroup, having suffered a high rate of casualties. Meanwhile, on the 1st of January, the Japanese High Command finally yielded to the pleas of their army and naval commanders in the Solomons and agreed to evacuate Guadalcanal and withdraw up the slot to New Georgia. Their decision was hastened by the fact that their 28th Division had been virtually wiped out when American aircraft intercepted the convoy carrying the division to Guadalcanal and sent most of the transports to the bottom. However, the Japanese High Command elected not to inform their forces on Guadalcanal of the decision until the last possible moment, a few weeks hence. In the interim, the defenders of Guadalcanal would fight on, feeling that they were there to stay. Reinforcements would still be fed in until the evacuation was ready to proceed. On the same day that the Japanese were debating the fate of their garrison on Guadalcanal, the Americans renewed their efforts to take Mount Austin. This latest effort made some initial headway, but the tenacious Japanese defense made it obvious that a quick victory was beyond the ability of the attackers. The planned offensive for the rest of the island called for the attacking units to break out of the defensive perimeter around Henderson Field in a two-pronged drive toward the center of the island and toward Cape Esperance at the northern end. There could be no broad front since the jungle terrain prohibited that type of attack. The attackers would be required to move forward in single columns and outflank and cut off enemy pockets of resistance. Patch's offensive began promptly on the 10th of January after an intense artillery barrage. Immediately after the last gun ceased firing, the attack jumped off. Progress was slow and measured in yards, as the Americans were forced to hack their way through the heavy jungle growth. The columns were required to halt frequently to deal with enemy rear guard holding up the advance. Some of the initial objectives fell quickly, but the skilled and determined Japanese resisted every step. Each day's attack was preceded by the usual deadly artillery barrage. Then the attack moved forward. The enemy was encountered everywhere along the jungle tracks, and gains were measured in terms of yards instead of miles. On the 14th, the Tokyo Express landed 600 reinforcements at Cape Esperance, bolstering the Japanese belief that the island was to be held at all cost. The Americans were forced to fight for each yard. Nevertheless, steady progress was made. After over a week of repeated attacks, however, Patch was forced to sanction a pause to regroup. Meanwhile, the defenders of Mount Austin continued to cling tenaciously to their positions. After moving fresh troops to the front, Patch ordered the attack to go forward on the 22nd. At the same time, Collins' troops noticed a weakening of the enemy defense on Mount Austin. A daily artillery and aerial pounding was beginning to take its toll. 5 days before Patch renewed the offensive, the Japanese formally received word of the intended evacuation. By that time, the Imperial troops were half-starved, disease-ridden and exhausted from the constant American attacks on land and in the air. On the 23rd of January, relentless American pressure finally yielded results. A large pocket of Japanese was surrounded by American troops driving through the jungle. The pocket was systematically eliminated by rifle and artillery fire. All but a few of the enemy force were destroyed. That same day, the last defenders of Mount Austin perished as Collins' troops overran their positions. Since the Japanese rarely surrendered, the Americans had to annihilate each enemy soldier before declaring the position secure. Now the drive for Cape Esperance gathered steam. But the Tokyo Express continued to make his presence felt. As the bulk of the Japanese fell back to the Cape, their rear guards continued to impede the American advance, and progress remained slow. The Americans were unaware of the Japanese decision to evacuate Guadalcanal, and the enemy took advantage of this. Therefore, there was little slackening in the ferocity of the defense. In the meantime, another chapter in the naval battle for Guadalcanal was written. Unaware that the enemy had written off Guadalcanal, the Americans continued to reinforce the island. Convoys reaching the area had to be protected from Japanese attacks, and naturally required the presence of escorting warships. During the unloading of one of these convoys, the veteran of the Battle of Savo, the United States ship Chicago, was sunk by Japanese aircraft shortly after the Battle of Rennell Island. The attackers had intended to attack the supply convoy, but were diverted by the presence of the Chicago and decided to attack that hapless vessel. As Patch's forces approached the coast, the Tokyo Express began to evacuate the Japanese forces. On the 1st of February, 3,000 survivors of General Sano's 38th Division, once over 8,000 strong, boarded transports and left Guadalcanal behind. 2 nights later, it was the turn of the remnants of the once powerful Sendai Division, their ranks now decimated. The Sendai would never again be a significant force in battle. Finally, on the night of the 7th of February, the 3,000-man rear guard, having successfully held off all American attacks, boarded ship and sailed away. After linking up on the 4th, the 2 American columns drove for the coast, but, unaware of Japanese intentions, proceeded with caution. There had been too many ambushes, too many enemy soldiers lurking behind each tree and fallen log. It was folly to drive headlong against an enemy skilled in defensive use of the jungle and who preferred death to surrender. Patch knew that eventually American superiority would prevail and was therefore unwilling to accept a high butcher's bill. In addition, Neither he nor the American naval commanders had any idea that the Japanese intended to abandon the island, particularly since that concept was in direct conflict with previous Japanese strategy. Although small pockets of abandoned Japanese troops required mopping up, by the middle of February all organized resistance on Guadalcanal had ceased. On the 8th of that month, Patch sent the following message to Halsey: "Organized resistance on Guadalcanal has ceased." Halsey replied, "When I sent a Patch to act as tailor for Guadalcanal, I did not expect him to remove the enemy's pants and sew it on so quickly. Thanks, and congratulations." Japanese losses on Guadalcanal exceeded 25,000. Countless more perished en route. 5,000 American Marines, soldiers and sailors died fighting for the small piece of steaming jungle. Another 16,000 were wounded or laid low by disease during the bitter 6-month struggle. It was a costly but significant victory. On the positive side, the myth of Japanese invincibility was shattered forever. Even more vital, invaluable jungle fighting experience was gained. More importantly, Guadalcanal became the springboard from which the campaign against the rest of the Solomons was launched. The Americans turned it into a forward staging area for the conquest of places like New Georgia and Bougainville. Eventually, as the Americans climbed the Solomons chain, Rabaul itself was isolated and abandoned as a naval base by the Japanese. Throughout the campaign, Henderson Field was an unsinkable aircraft carrier providing aerial cover for the troops, and from which bombing attacks against Japanese strongpoints were launched. To protect Rabaul, the Japanese were forced to strip forces from other theaters, thereby allowing the Allied juggernaut to continue unchecked. In those 6 months of conflict, American Marines, sailors and GIs had written a glorious chapter in the annals of American arms. One Japanese general felt that the Japanese army had bled to death in the jungles of Guadalcanal. He was correct. Guadalcanal is now the site of the capital of the Solomon Islands. The city of Honiara Housing, the government sits where the Marine base at Lunga Point sat some 10-odd years ago. Henderson Field is now a bustling modem airport. The Japanese have returned. Under trade agreements with the Solomon Islands government, the former enemy has cut down many of the hardwood trees of the previously thick jungle. Lacking the cover afforded by the treetop foliage, the swamps have dried up and in their place are farmland. Graham Kent has described the scene this way: "In remote villages there are still reminders of the war. Most village schools have an empty shell case for use as the school bell. Japanese swords are used as digging implements. Helmets make bowls. Some names remain from the war years: Red Beach, Iron Bottom Sound, and others. They are reminders of the time when a remote South Pacific island became a vicious center of a war." On the 20th of July, 1943, the Joint Chiefs of Staff directed Admiral Nimitz to begin making plans for the capture of the Gilbert Islands. The operation was given the code name Galvanic. The primary purpose of Galvanic was to provide the Americans with bases for the forthcoming and more difficult operation against the Marshalls, as well as ensuring the safety of Samoa and the communication line between Hawaii and the South and Southwest Pacific. The commander of the 5th Amphibious Corps for the Gilbert operation, Major General Holland Smith, stated in his post-war book, Coral and Brass, that Tarawa was a mistake. But was it? Over 1,000 Americans died there, and more than 2,000 were wounded during the capture of an island no larger than New York City's Central Park. Opinion still varies, but these authors agree with those who feel that the capture of Tarawa was indeed a necessity. The official Army history states, "In the minds of most American military planners and strategists, the cost of the capture of the Gilberts was justified both in the terms of the strategic gains realized and the tactical lessons learned." With the exception of geography enthusiasts, very few people had even heard of Tarawa before November 1943. What made Tarawa so important was its strategic location. Lying southwest of Pearl Harbor and northeast of New Zealand and Australia, it is directly astride the important lifeline between Hawaii and Australia. As part of the Gilbert Islands, Tarawa Atoll was the main headquarters of the Japanese garrison, in addition to being the site of the principal airfield in the island group. Why Tarawa was selected as a target by the Americans' rates examination. In March 1943, the Joint Chiefs of Staff held a Pacific military conference to deal with strategy in that theater. As in so many prior conferences, differences in strategy between Admiral King and General MacArthur occurred. King was thinking of moving naval forces from Hawaii and the United States across the Central Pacific. This plan had been discussed in pre-war naval conferences. MacArthur, with a return to the Philippines foremost in his mind, championed the capture of New Guinea and the reduction of the Japanese base at Rabaul, to be followed by a movement northwestward toward the ultimate goal of the Philippine Islands. No definitive plan for a Central Pacific operation was agreed upon at the conference, but the ground had been broken. At the Trident Conference 2 months later in May, King proposed that one of the major objectives of the conference be the development of a master plan for the conduct of the war. On the 21st of that month, after tedious days of discussing European strategy, the Admiral finally got his chance to review his Pacific strategy. During this session, he emphasized the importance of the Central Pacific as a potential avenue of approach to Japan. Although greatly impressed by King's presentation, the British, fearing a dilution of the effort in Europe, refused to allow the Admiral carte blanche in the Pacific. Nevertheless, the possibility of a Central Pacific drive moved closer to eventual acceptance. As a result, King was confident enough to begin organizing the forces for the offensive. At the Quadrant Conference that August, King was given approval by the combined chiefs for the seizure of the Gilberts, Marshalls, and the Marianas. The Central Pacific drive was accepted. The first target would be the Gilberts. Initially, the first objective of the Central Pacific drive was to have been the Marshall Islands. In the belief, however, that these islands bristled with defenses and because the Japanese naval base at Truk, believed to be a bastion, was closer to the Marshalls, thereby posing a distinct threat, it was proposed that the Gilberts be seized first. The latter appeared to be an easier target, and their possession would be of great value to the Central Pacific drive. Under the overall command of the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, Admiral Nimitz, Operation Galvanic would be directly commanded by Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance, whose forces were given the designation Fifth Fleet. Though considered a battleship admiral, Spruance's stand-in role at Midway proved without doubt that he was capable of commanding carriers. In addition, Spruance was considered one of the finest thinkers in the Navy. In fact, since Midway, he had been Nimitz's chief of staff. Though he possessed a reserved personality, Spruance was highly respected and would prove repeatedly to be an excellent choice despite the inevitable critics. For Amphibious commander, Spruance requested Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner. Turner had already earned a reputation as an aggressive and hard taskmaster. The Amphibious commander had little trouble living up to his nickname, Terrible Turner. His competence, however, could not be doubted, and his role during the Guadalcanal and Central Solomons campaigns bore this out. For Corps commander, Spruance needed an officer who was an expert on amphibious attacks. Accordingly, he chose Marine Major General Holland M. Smith. Nicknamed Howling Mad Smith, the Marine General, like Admiral Turner, had a well-deserved reputation for gruffness and aggressiveness. Though he had yet to be directly involved in any campaign, Smith had trained both Army and Marine forces in the tactics and techniques of amphibious attacks. Despite his quick temper, Smith's ability was not doubted. The major flaw in his personality was his partisanship for the Marine Corps. That partisanship would later raise ruffles during the Gilberts operation and reach an explosive climax during the Marianas campaign in the summer of 1944. 2 divisions were selected for Operation Galvanic: the 2nd Marine Division, commanded by Major General Julian Smith, and the Army's 27th Infantry Division, a former New York National Guard unit commanded by Major General Ralph Smith. Thus, the 3 leading troop commanders were all named Smith. The Marine Division had already bloodied themselves at Guadalcanal, but the 27th Division had yet to see combat. The 2 targets chosen for the operation were Tarawa and Nauru. During the planning stages for Galvanic, however, Holland Smith and Turner approached Spruance with a proposal to substitute one of the targets for another. The original target, Nauru, they said, should be substituted with Macon. There were a number of logical reasons they used to support their case. Nauru and Tarawa were a distance apart, thereby requiring a division of the allotted naval forces who would be required to support separate operations 380 miles apart. Macon, on the other hand, was closer to Tarawa and would allow the fleet to support both operations simultaneously. In addition, Nauru was believed to be heavily defended, thus requiring the employment of more troops than Macon. Furthermore, Nauru was devoid of good beaches and did not have an airfield or a lagoon to accommodate large ships. Spruance noted, "Nauru was not needed by us, and we could keep it pounded down." On the other hand, Macon was 100 miles closer to the Marshalls where we were going, and it tied in well from the point of view of fleet coverage with an operation against Tarawa. Macon was an entirely suitable objective, and its capture was well within our capabilities. Nimitz agreed with the proposal and presented the arguments to King, who also gave his consent to the substitution of Macon for Nauru. Apamama was also added as a target, though the planners foresaw no difficulty in taking the atoll. Tarawa was by far the most important target of Operation Galvanic. Little Betio possessed an airfield, and all intelligence estimates pointed to a large Japanese garrison. The task of seizing Betio was given to the veteran 2nd Marines. This division had proven itself in combat in the steamy jungles of Guadalcanal, with the 2nd Regiment having landed there on day, the 7th of August, 1942. The division's remaining regiments landed later and remained until the campaign ended in February, 1943. After leaving Guadalcanal, the division went to New Zealand for a period of rest and rehabilitation. The change of climate was welcome to the Marines, since many of them suffered from scores of jungle ailments. While revitalizing itself, the division also began training for its next objective, whatever and wherever that might be. The training consisted of numerous types of maneuvers, chief of which was the amphibious attack. In August 1943, Julian Smith and his operations officer, Lieutenant Colonel David Shoup, received the official word that Betio Island on Tarawa Atoll would be the next target. The Marine officers quickly realized that amphibious tactics would have to be honed to a fine edge if the attack was to be successful. Shoup, seeing that the islet was surrounded by reefs, immediately put in a request for amphibious boats capable of traversing the reefs. He was informed that none were readily available as yet, but that some were forthcoming, although not enough to handle all the attack waves. Consequently, training would have to be in the non-tracted attack craft, the landing craft, vehicle and personnel. Betio is a flat island, its highest point a mere 10 feet above sea level. Approximately 2.5 miles long and 600 yards across at its widest point, it had been likened to a bird because of its distinct shape. Intelligence reports indicated that it was bristling with defenses. The first problem facing Julian Smith's troops was the traversing of the reef. Amphibious tractors, landing vehicle tracked or Amtraks, could solve this problem. As already indicated, however, these were in short supply and only enough to handle the first waves would be available. The follow-up waves of attackers would have to rely on landing crafts, vehicle and personnel. These boats drew about 3.5 feet of water. Thus, a primary concern was, would the water on day be more than 3.5 feet deep? Optimistically, the American planners accepted the estimate that there would be at least 5 feet of water above the reefs. Nevertheless, there was always the possibility of a low tide no more than 2 feet high. There was also the remote possibility of a dodging tide, a tide with an eccentric course that could not be predicted. The planners tended to discount the latter and believed that there would be sufficient water depth on day, scheduled for the 20th of November. One New Zealander, Major Holland, however, said that there was a danger that the invasion tide might experience a neap period characterized by irregular flows. There might be, he stated, only 3 feet of water. Based on available information, therefore, Julian Smith felt that there was a 50-50 chance that the landing craft would be able to traverse the reefs and prepared his troops for the worst eventuality. On the 2nd of October, Julian Smith and his staff flew to Pearl Harbor to present their plans for the capture of Betio. Hydrographic and reef conditions, they pointed out, determined where on Betio the attack troops would land. The reef on the ocean side lies 600 yards from the island and is subjected to heavy swells from the open sea. Aerial reconnaissance showed Betio's defenses to be heaviest on the ocean shore. For these reasons, it was proposed to attack Betio from the lagoon side. While presenting his plans, Julian Smith was handed unwelcome news. He wanted to secure a small island adjacent to Betio so that artillery could be situated there to support the main landing. But Holland Smith stated that this plan would have to be scrapped since transports for a secondary landing could not be spared. Furthermore, speed of conquest was considered a vital necessity. American intelligence estimates anticipated a strong Japanese reaction by air and from under the sea. Thus, Betio had to be taken quickly. No time could be spared for secondary attacks. Julian Smith was disappointed with the news, but he was even more appalled when told that one of his regiments would be held in reserve to be used either at Macon or Tarawa, depending on need. The 2nd Marine Commander stated, "Not only would the Betio attack be made without preliminary artillery support, but it would be made by only 2 regimental combat teams." Preliminary intelligence reports indicated that there was over 4,000 Japanese at Tarawa in well-dug positions. The thought of losing the services of the extra regiment was not very appealing. For Galvanic, Admiral Spruance's forces were divided into a northern attack force under Rear Admiral Turner and a southern attack force under Rear Admiral Harry Hill. Turner led the northern attack force at Macon because he believed that its proximity to the marshals and truck placed it at the more threatened point. Macon Atoll's shape is similar to that of Tarawa. The large island of Butaritari was the target of the 165th Regimental Combat Team of the 27th Infantry Division. The planners estimated that some 500 to 800 Japanese inhabited this 6-mile-long strip of coral and sand. The planners did not feel that the reef around the island would present the troops with too much difficulty. Basically, very little was known about the Gilberts. Though they had been a pre-war British possession, existing information regarding tides and water levels were for the most part inaccurate. Precise data was needed before committing men to fight. Through aerial photographs, submarine reconnaissance, and the interrogation of former residents, the planners went about their task. Countless photographs were taken of the islands during bombing raids on the 17th of September and 18th, as well as later on in the month and during October. The bulk of the information on the Japanese defences were gleaned from these photographs. According to Henry Shaw, Jr., the aerial camera had its limitations, however, and the combination of vertical and oblique shots answered only some of the many questions that plagued the planners. Additional information was garnered by the submarine Nautilus. For almost 3 weeks during September, the submarine studied tides and currents at the 3 objectives. It also photographed the targets, which, from its vantage point, gave a reasonably good series of panoramic views. Pearl Harbor received this information on the 7th of October. Meanwhile, a group of 16 former residents of the Gilberts were brought to Pearl Harbor in order to share their knowledge of the atolls with Admiral Turner's planners. Those familiar with Tarawa were sent to Wellington, New Zealand, to confer with the 2nd Marine Division staff. The question that continued to haunt the planners, of course, was the all-important height of the tides across the reefs. Opinion on that point continued to vary. If the tides were too low for the landing boats and they got hung up on the reefs, it could spell disaster for the invading troops. The reef at Betio was anywhere from 600 to 1,100 yards from shore. On the north shore there was a long pier stretching all the way to the edge of the reef. It was this point that the planners concentrated their amphibious plans upon. The western and southern beaches were too exposed to heavy swells and irregular currents, making logistical support a nightmare. The northern shore, however, would have the atoll's lagoon as a shield for the ships which, logistically speaking, was necessary to facilitate the landing. The atoll itself measured 22 miles long and was shaped like a triangle. Betio was the atoll's westernmost island on its southern end. The entrance to the lagoon lay 3.5 miles north of Betio. While the planners were putting the finishing touches on their plans, the attack continued to rehearse. The training of the 27th Infantry Division was the responsibility of both General Richardson's Army Headquarters and Holland Smith's 5th Amphibious Corps. The Army Command concentrated on ground tactics, while the Marine trainers focused their efforts on amphibious tactics. During this period, both Richardson and Smith managed to antagonize each other. Richardson resented the Marine Corps command and rankled over the fact that a Marine general had authority over GIs. Holland Smith, in turn, resented the Army general's attitude and disliked his being overlooked by Richardson and the latter's insistence that the 5th Amphibious Corps be dissolved completely. A difference of opinion had already developed between Holland Smith and the commander of the 27th Division, Major General Ralph Smith. The Marine general wanted the attack troops to land on Butaritari's lagoon side. On the other hand, Ralph Smith wanted to land 2 battalions on the west coast of the island and send the other battalion near the island's middle from the lagoon side 2 hours after the initial attack. The Army's plan was accepted. Meanwhile, the 27th attempted to hold amphibious exercises in the Hawaiian Islands. Bad weather and poor attack beaches detracted from the rehearsals, throwing into doubt the value of these sessions. What of the Japanese in the Gilberts? They had seized control of the islands on the 10th of December, 1941, with the primary purpose of providing Japan with forward observation posts. Originally, the islands were not fortified, but were instead garrisoned by coast watchers scattered through the island group. A seaplane base was later built on Makin, from which reconnaissance planes could scan the vast ocean spaces. On the 17th of August, 1942, 221 Marines landed on Butaritari Islands from 2 American submarines. Led by the indomitable Colonel Evans Carlson, the Marines exposed to the Japanese the vulnerability of the Gilberts. Unless they were reinforced immediately, they could easily be captured by the Americans. Almost immediately, the Japanese began to dispatch reinforcements to the Gilberts and began to fortify the atolls. By the end of 1942, the Japanese realized the importance of the Gilberts. If the empire were going to be held, it must be held from the Gilberts. They designed an ingenious trap. If the Americans attempted to recapture the Gilberts, they would find themselves pinned down by superior defenses. By holding the attackers at bay long enough, the Japanese felt they could buy time to allow aircraft, submarines, and the surface fleet to reach the scene and annihilate the Americans. Thus, the Gilberts became an integral part of Japan's outer defensive perimeter that stretched north to the Aleutians, southward through the Marshalls and Gilberts to the Bismarcks. Strong ground defenses and quick action by the Imperial fleet would thwart any American attempt to penetrate the outer perimeter. Betio Island at Tarawa became the focal point of the Japanese defensive plans in the Gilberts. An airfield was constructed there, and a series of strong points, each mutually supportive of the others, was built. The basic Japanese doctrine called for annihilation of the Americans at the beach. In the event the attackers gained a foothold, vigorous counterattacks would be launched to hurl the enemy back into the sea. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki was in command at Tarawa. He had about 3,000 effective troops available and approximately 2,000 laborers of dubious quality. The combat troops were Japan's Special Naval Landing Force, commonly referred to erroneously by the Americans as Japanese Marines. Nevertheless, they were well-trained and tenacious fighters. The laborers, on the other hand, were mainly Koreans and not trained for combat. On Makin, there were about 384 Special Naval Landing Force troops with perhaps 446 laborers. Apamama held 25 Japanese defenders. Admiral Shibasaki turned Betio into a veritable fortress. All along the shore he placed a series of strong points. Pillboxes and gun emplacements were situated so that none had blindside approaches. Many of these were underground or behind thick concrete casings. Others were reinforced with protected layers of coconut logs, coral and sand. Rifle pits, trenches and machine gun nests were numerous. Ringing the island between 50 and 100 yards offshore were barbed wire fences, concrete tetrahedrons and other beach obstacles. Around Betio's beaches, a log barricade was constructed. Butaritari was far less fortified. Lieutenant Seizo Ishikawa commanded the forces there. His defences centred around King's Wharf on the lagoon side. Obstacles were built which crossed the island. In addition, the island was dotted by machine gun nests and pillboxes, but these were far less than on Betio. As 1,943 waned, Admiral Shibasaki boasted of his defensive strength. He was so confident that Betio was impregnable that he bragged that 1,000,000 Marines fighting for 100 years would be unable to take the island. He failed to count on the United States Marines. As the Marines continued their rehearsals, the commander of the initial attack unit, the 2nd Regiment, fell ill. To replace him, Julian Smith selected Lieutenant Colonel David Shoup, who was given an immediate promotion to colonel. As the date for Galvanic approached, raids against the targets were stepped up by air forces operating from Canton and Funafute Islands. On the 13th of November, the 7th Air Force began a systematic attack pattern with the Japanese airfields in both the Gilberts and Marshalls as their primary targets. Rear Admiral Charles Pownall, the commander of Task Force 50, comprising the carriers, sent his planes to Nauru on November 18 and Jaluit and Mill in the Marshalls on the following day. These attacks were designed to isolate the target area. On the 13th, Task Force 52 under Admiral Hill left F8, where 4 days later it rendezvoused with Turner's force moving up from Hawaii. As the American forces approached their targets, many of the Marines were optimistic. They were informed of the heavy pre-landing bombardment by both the carrier planes and the big guns of the battleships, cruisers and destroyers, and felt sure nothing would be left after such an awesome expenditure of explosives. Other Marines, however, were skeptical and knew that the Japanese were fanatical and would find some method to survive the heavy bombardment. Julian Smith commented, "We Marines, all of whom had studied, and in some cases seen in actual combat the effect of land artillery, fire, ships, gunfire, and aerial bombardment, found naval officers unduly optimistic as to the results to be obtained from the bombardment. As the ships approached the Gilberts, the troops made ready. Some cleaned their weapons, others read, played cards, wrote letters, or prayed. Religious services were well attended. Final instructions were passed down. Day would be the 20th of November, 1943. While the attack force was at sea, Holland Smith and Kelly Turner embarked for Macon. Convinced that Macon was vulnerable to enemy counterattack, Smith hoped to prod the GIs along to rapid victory. Fortunately for the Americans, the Japanese fleet was never a factor, since the forces that were destined to sortie from Truk had been severely reduced by a number of battles fought earlier in November near Rabaul and in the northern Solomons. The wisdom of a two-pronged approach to Japan was beginning to pay dividends. Day dawned bright and clear. The early morning hours found the Marines climbing down from their troop transports to their attack vehicles. 100 of the vehicles were Amtraks, the rest were attack boats. While the men moved into the waiting vessels, the pre-landing bombardment began. First came the carrier planes, who strafed and bombed targets on Betio for half an hour. Following the planes, the support ships opened up a 2-hour-long bombardment concentrated on the coastal defense guns. As the attack waves approached the beaches, the carrier planes returned for a final 5-minute strike at beach defenses. Some of the attackers wondered how anything could survive such a pounding. The bombardment cloaked the target in a thick haze. As the planes dropped their deadly loads, the landing vehicles, tracked, made for the lagoon entrance. The first wave was made up of 42 landing vehicles, tracked. Hour was scheduled for 8:30, out a strong western current delayed the landing for half an hour. The attack troops headed for 3 beaches named, respectively, Red 1, Red 2, and Red 3. Red 1 was approximately 700 yards long and ran from the northwest tip of the island. Red 2 was 600 yards long, ending at the coastal pier. The largest beach was Red 3, 800 yards long. The long pier was the dominant feature of the landing area, and its early capture was essential. First Lieutenant William D. Hawkins, commander of the 2nd Scout Sniper Platoon, was given the vital task of securing this target. His forces landed at 8:55 and quickly secured the ramp that sloped downward from the pier to the edge of the reef. Japanese fire began to crack near gasoline drums that the defenders had placed at the pier's end. Hawkins waved his men back to their landing boats, while 2nd Lieutenant Alan Leslie, along with 4 scouts armed with flamethrowers, began advancing along the pier toward the shore, systematically destroying anything that might harbor enemy snipers. Fires spread onto the pier itself, and soon a large gap formed. Having secured the pier, Hawkins led his men shoreward. The Americans discovered rather quickly that the Japanese had survived the awesome bombardment. Henry Shaw described it this way: "Awesome as it had been, the preliminary bombardment did not knock out all the defenses. The coast defense guns had been silenced, many of the dual-purpose anti-aircraft weapons and anti-boat guns had been put out of action, but most of the concrete pillboxes and emplacements protected by coconut logs and sand survived both bombs and shells." Landing on Red Beach 1 was Major John Shoettel's 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marine Regiment, 3 halves. Red Beach 2 was the target of the regiment's 2nd Battalion, 2 halves under Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Amy. Major Henry Crow's 2nd Battalion of the 8th Regiment, 2/8, headed toward Red Beach 3. In reserve was Major Wood B. Kyle's 1st Battalion of the 2nd Regiment, 1 half. At 9:10, Schwettel's force swarmed ashore on Red 1. I Company quickly pushed over the log wall and began to advance inland. Japanese fire then began to pour into the Marines' ranks, and casualties began to mount. Major Crow's 2/8 reached Red 3 at 9:17. Thanks to the pre-landing bombardment, the Japanese there were temporarily stunned. This allowed 2 landing vehicles, tracked to advance as far as the airstrip. Of the 552 men who landed in the first 3 waves, less than 25 became casualties on Red 3. It was at Red 2, where Lieutenant Colonel Amy's 2 halves landed, that casualties were the highest. In one company alone, 50% of the men went down. Some tractors carrying Marines took direct artillery hits that annihilated or wounded the occupants. Those who survived were forced to wade ashore under heavy enemy machine gun fire. Casualties mounted at an alarming rate. Following the first 3 waves of landing vehicles, tracked came 2 waves of landing crafts, vehicle and personnel. When these reached the reef, the Marines found to their horror that the water was too shallow to allow the boats to float over. The troops were left with 2 alternatives: transfer to landing vehicles, tracked if possible, or wade ashore carrying their weapons and equipment. The heaviest casualties were among those forced to wade ashore. Units became separated as the men scrambled to get to the beach. Few reserve units were able to reach Betio in their normal combat team organization. On Red 2, Lieutenant Colonel Amy was annihilated while attempting to wade ashore, so Colonel Shoup ordered an observer from the 4th Marine Division, Lieutenant Colonel Walter Jordan, to assume command of the 2 halves. Getting off the beach and over the wall proved just as deadly as landing. Thanks only to the valor of a few individuals, some progress was made. Staff Sergeant William Bordelon survived an enemy shell that destroyed the landing vehicle, tracked on which he was riding. Leading the survivors of his unit ashore, Bordelon filled 2 enemy pillboxes with demolition charges and blew them up. Like a man possessed, he advanced toward a 3rd enemy position, but was critically wounded. However, that did not prevent the sergeant, who denied medical aid and continued to fight. Blood pouring from his wounds, he waded back into the water and selflessly helped the injured. After reaching the beach again, he single-handedly attacked another enemy, Strong Point, but this time was cut down by Japanese fire. For his valor, Sergeant Bordelon was posthumously awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. Meanwhile, Colonel Shoup had his own particular difficulty getting ashore. Eventually he reached the pier and worked his way along the structure. Around noontime he was finally able to establish his command post on Red 2. Before establishing his command post, Shoup ordered Kyle's 1 half to move westward from Red 2 and support the embattled forces on Red 1. Enemy fire was so intense that some of Kyle's battalion veered off course and landed on Red 1 while others landed closer to the pier. Landing was an absolute horror, with some units suffering up to 70% casualties in the effort. As the day progressed, the number of landing vehicles tracked began to dwindle. Many of them were destroyed, others were damaged, while some suffered mechanical difficulties. This forced additional attack troops to take the landing crafts, vehicle and personnel to the reef and wade ashore. 500 yards from shore and carrying their weapons above their heads, the Marines, under deadly and accurate fire from the concealed enemy, struggled shoreward. Many of the men, in an effort to make themselves as small a target as possible, crouched low in the water. Nevertheless, they remained little more than clay pigeons. Major Schotel radioed Shoup that his troops were being held up on the reef on the right flank of Red 1 and were coming under heavy fire in the water. Shoup responded by ordering him to land on Red 2 and work west. That provided Schotel with little solace, for the Japanese had already decimated his unit and reduced the battalion's effectiveness drastically. Schotel remained on the reef with his men for several hours. If tractored landing vehicles had been available, they could have come right in. Finally, that afternoon, he was ordered to land at any cost and regain control of the battalion. Schotel and his men waded ashore. Not only had the heavy Japanese fire caused great confusion, but also lack of communications hampered the American units ashore. Offshore, the blast of the large batteries of the flagship, the battleship Maryland, also disrupted communications. On shore, the salt water had ruined much of the vital communications gear. Confusion reigned supreme. Enemy fire was not the only cause of casualties. Some of the heavily laden Marines stepped into deep holes in the reefs and were dragged under and drowned. Still, they continued to wade ashore. The water turned red from the blood of their comrades, and yet they continued to come. The Marines fought gallantly on. The second and third attack waves saw the carnage and knew what to expect. Taking a lesson from the first wave, the attack boats were ordered to the pier. This at least afforded the men some measure of protection, but not enough. Japanese marksmen concentrated their fire on the pier, resulting in heavy American casualties. From his command post on Red 2, Shoup drew a bleak picture of the attack thus far. The 2/8 was in the best shape, holding positions near the airfield. The other battalions, however, barely had a toehold. Despite the poor communications, Shoup was able to piece together a dreary image. Having drawn his conclusion, he sent an officer back to the command ship with a revised attack plan. Shoup proposed to attack south and west in order to unite the beachheads before attempting to seize the eastern end of the island. He was a determined fighter, and added this sentence to his message: "You tell the general and the admiral that we are going to stick and fight it out." Meanwhile, Julian Smith was drawing his own conclusions. One was to ask Holland Smith for the release of the Corps Reserve, the 6th Regimental Combat Team. More troops were obviously needed on Betio. In less than an hour's time, an affirmative answer was forthcoming from Holland Smith and Admiral Turner. Julian Smith also decided to land the 1/8 at the earliest possible time, but because of the communications breakdown was unable to get in touch with Shoup to discuss where this unit should land. The 1/8 waited in their attack craft through the rest of the day and into the night for the order to move shoreward. The men were cramped, hungry, tired and anxious, and many of them became seasick. Poor communications was a plague to the attack. According to Shaw, water, shell fragments, bullets, and rough handling played havoc with communications equipment. Julian Smith urgently needed up-to-date information. To obtain it, he sent the Assistant Division Commander, Brigadier General Leo Hermley. The latter reached the Long Pier, and despite great difficulties managed to establish sporadic radio contact with Shoup. The colonel informed Hermley of the desperate shortage of ammunition and water. Throughout the night, Hermley organized carrying parties to bring the badly needed supplies ashore. During the night, he lost contact with Shoup and was forced to send a runner to find out where the colonel wanted the reserves landed. At 3:45, Hermley received his answer, but then his radio acted up and he was unable to contact General Smith. He went to the lagoon, boarded the destroyer Ringgold, and used that ship's radio to inform Smith that Shoup wanted the 1/8 to land near the Long Pier on Red 2. Following that, Hermley was ordered to report to Smith on the Maryland, where he learned that the evening before he had been ordered to take command of the fighting ashore. The faulty communications resulted in the message going astray, thus leaving Shoup in command. The first day's fighting on Betio had been vicious. The presence of a few tanks helped the situation somewhat, but the Japanese menaced the Marines from every angle. There was simply no easy way to approach the mutually supporting enemy positions without coming under fire. One by one, using flamethrowers, satchel charges, and Bangalore torpedoes, each strong point was painfully reduced. By nightfall of the first day, Shoup was able to state that his forces held a precarious toehold on the island. Although there was no sense of panic, from past experiences the Marines prepared themselves for the inevitable enemy counterattack. The pier was a scene of mass confusion. Men huddled together beneath the structure or close to its sides while supplies were dumped on the pier's end. There they waited for some brave men to attempt to run them onto the beach. Even after darkness, there was no let-up in the Japanese machine gun fire. Adding to the Marines' woes was the infiltration of enemy snipers, who took advantage of the darkness and moved offshore into damaged landing craft, where they were able to fire upon the Americans from improved vantage points. Incredibly, no counterattack took place the first night. The Marines' precarious toehold could have been easily dislodged by an all-out attack. In fact, after the battle, Julian Smith commented, "Admiral Shibasaki lost the battle by failing to counterattack on that first night, for never again would the beachhead be so vulnerable." Shibasaki's failure to launch a counterattack may have been due to his own communications breakdown. The Japanese relied heavily on wire communications. Most of this system was chewed up by the pre-landing bombardment. The Japanese command post was totally cut off from the fighting troops. The next morning, the huddled Marines were greeted by a sight of utter devastation. The crowded beaches were littered with landing vehicles, tracked, weapons, supplies, grounded tanks and bodies. Doctors administered to the wounded while bodies covered with ponchos dotted the Dantesque landscape. Men mingled with others from different units. All shared one thing in common. They had survived the first night on Betio. Could the day be worse? By dawn, the tide had also gone out, and looming in front of the men on the attack crafts was the exposed reef. Bloated bodies could be seen floating near or on the reef. The tropical heat quickly decomposed bodies, creating a stench fit for the scene. The unforgettable odor was everywhere. The men on Betio were saturated with it. It clung to their clothing and filled their nostrils, and it reached out across the reef and provided an unpleasant foretaste of the island to the men of the 1st Battalion, 8th Marines. The 1/8th had spent the night huddling in their boats at the line of departure, anxiously waiting for orders to land. Along with Major Hayes, the battalion commander was Colonel Hall, the regimental commander. Hall finally received his orders to land on Red 2. Almost immediately, their landing craft, vehicle, and personnel grounded on the reef, and the slow, deadly wade to the shore began. On shore, the survivors of day watched the macabre scene of their fellow Marines bracing the deadly Japanese fire. Added to the fire from shore was that of snipers holed up in a destroyed ship's hulk. The snipers opened up on the backs of the Marines. Even quicker than the previous day, if that was possible, the casualties began to mount. Major Hayes reported to Shoup for orders. With only half his battalion ashore and badly disorganized, his command was in poor shape. Fortunately for the Americans, Shoup's leadership proved inspired. He overcame the uncertainty of the situation and began to make sense out of chaos. He told Hayes that his battalion was to attack westward, where Major Ryan's force was isolated. Shoup then went over the rest of his attack plan for D+1. The main feature of the plan was a drive across Betio by the 1/2 and 2/2 to gain a foothold on the ocean shore. Before beginning the attack, Shoup called in carrier aircraft to soften up the enemy positions south of the airstrip. Unfortunately, bomb fragments and ricocheting bullets fell on the Marines, and Shoup was forced to call off the bombing attack. The Japanese raked the airfield with machine gun fire. American casualties mounted at an alarming rate. At 13 o'clock, 200 men leaped from their foxholes and dashed onto the runway. Luckily, the Japanese positions in the interior were not as strong as those along the shore. Despite heavy fire, the attackers' casualties were light. After crossing the airfield, the Marines entered the tangled growth and shattered palm trees south of the airfield. But no sooner had they arrived on the south shore than they were struck by a strong enemy counterattack. Heavy casualties were sustained by both sides, and soon the American ammunition stocks reached a critical low point. The nagging radio problems prevented the men on the south shore from notifying Shoup of their plight. At the eastern end, on Red 3, Major Crow's 2/8 was involved in a bitter struggle. Japanese resistance was extremely heavy, particularly in the vicinity of Betio's rather short second pier, called the Burns-Phillip Pier. By dusk of D+1, the Americans managed to occupy the pier, but enemy strong points south of the position prevented further progress. On Red Beach 1, after their precarious landing, Hayes' 1/8 moved steadily eastward. With the help of a medium tank, initial progress was relatively good. Unfortunately, one lone tank was simply not enough. Lacking flamethrowers with which to burn out the enemy strongpoints, the attack ground to a halt. The unit's flamethrowers had been lost during the passage from the reef to the shore. At dark, the 1/8 consolidated its position with hopes the next day would bring further success. The most significant progress was made by Major Ryan on the west end of Betio. There, with the help of accurate naval support, the Marines were able to advance down the island's western coast, Green Beach. After proceeding along the beach, Ryan shifted his forces inland about 200 yards from the shore. Bypassed Japanese positions were taken care of with flamethrowers and satchel charges. Despite the loss of the western beaches, the Japanese continued to hold the eastern and southern parts of the island. At the same time, many of the northern beaches were still bitterly contested. While the battle ashore raged, the reserve regiment, the 6th Marines, were anxiously waiting to land. The primary problem facing the divisional commander was where to land this unit. Smith needed definitive information as to the best location to send the 6th Marines. At 10:22, Shoup had sent a depressing message stating, "Situation ashore uncertain." As a result, Smith was determined to land the 6th at the earliest possible moment. The capture of Green Beach gave him a landing point. At 14, the first wave of the 1/6 began landing. The fresh unit quickly established a defensive position in anticipation of the next morning's counterattack. By nightfall of D+1, the beachhead extended almost 500 yards along the lagoon side of Betio on either side of the long pier. On the right, the 1/8 held a line running from the beach directly inland to the west taxiway. On the left, the 3/8's position stretched from the Burns Phillip Pier southward in an arch to the airfield. Red 2's and Red 3's beachheads had been enlarged while the 1/2 and 2/2 had traversed the island. By evening, therefore, Shoup was able to send a more optimistic report. Shortly after 17, he radioed, "Casualties many, percentage dead not known. Combat efficiency, we are winning." Shoup continued to control operations from his command post located in the shadow of an enemy bunker. Japanese troops continued to occupy this bunker, requiring the posting of guards at each exit. Overall, the fighting that second day was still bitter, but by evening, Shoup felt more confident. At 20:30, Colonel Edson, the division chief of staff, arrived at Shoup's headquarters and assumed overall command. Shoup had done a brilliant job and for his effort was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. The award citation stated, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, as commanding officer of all Marine Corps troops in action against enemy Japanese forces on Betio from 20 to the 22nd of November, 1943. Although severely shocked by an exploding enemy shell soon after landing at the pier and suffering from a serious, painful leg wound, Colonel Shoup fearlessly exposed himself. Rallying his hesitant troops by his own inspiring heroism, he gallantly led them across the fringing reefs to charge the heavily fortified island and reinforce our hard-pressed, thinly held lines. By his brilliant leadership, daring tactics and selfless devotion to duty, Colonel Shoup was largely responsible for the final decisive defeat of the enemy. As soon as Colonel Edson arrived, he immediately began planning the next day's attack with the aid of Shoup. Prior to the attack was the coordination of air support and naval gunfire on Betio's eastern end. The bombardment would work westward to the airstrip. The attack plan called for the 1/6 to pass through the 3/2, strike eastward from their position on Green Beach, and move along the south shore. Meanwhile, the 1/8 would attack westward along the lagoon shore with the objective of eliminating the Japanese pocket on the Red 1, Red 2 boundary. The remaining 2 battalions of the 8th Marines were to drive eastward. To add weight to the attack, artillery batteries were ordered to land and take up positions on the neighboring island of Bairiki. At 7 o'clock on the 22nd of November, the 1/8 launched its attack. With the support of 3 light tanks, they poured point-blank fire into the Japanese pillboxes. Even so, the enemy positions refused to yield. Once more, the Marines were forced to rely on Bangalore torpedoes and satchel charges to reduce the enemy's strongpoints. Although little ground was gained, many stubborn strongpoints were eliminated. Later in the day, the Japanese attempted a counterattack, but this failed. By day's end, the enemy on this part of the island were effectively isolated, and the Marines dug in for the night. Major Jones' 1/6 began their attack at 8 o'clock with the objective of clearing the south side of Betio and making contact with the 1/1 and 1/2. Those battalions, it will be remembered, had crossed the island on D1. Once contact was established with those 2 units, Jones's orders called for him to continue eastward. Tanks, flamethrowers, and satchel charges again became the most valuable weapons during the advance. Resistance proved relatively light, and casualties were kept to a minimum. By 11 o'clock, Jones had made contact with the 1/2. By that hour, except for the lone enemy pocket between Red 1 and Red 2, western Betio was for all intent and purpose secure. In the northern end of the island, the 2/8 prepared to launch its attack. The Japanese remained holed up in strong positions near the Burns Phillip Pier. One steel pillbox proved particularly hazardous, along with a coconut log emplacement from which the enemy raked the ranks of the advancing Marines. There was one other strong point, a large bomb-proof shelter somewhat to the south of the steel pillbox, which proved a great menace. Each of these strong points were mutually supporting. To attack one exposed the attack to the others. The entire 2nd Battalion found itself involved in the effort to reduce these positions. Mortar shells rained down on the Japanese positions while a medium tank fired its 75mm shells at the steel pillbox. Flamethrowers and demolition teams attacked the bomb-proof shelter. Finally, after a savage hour of fighting, the Marines managed to gain the top of the structure. At that point, the enemy counterattacked in large numbers. Thanks to the bravery of First Lieutenant Alexander Bonnyman, who personally drove back the attackers with a flamethrower, the position was held. Bonnyman died in the fight, but his action allowed the 2/8ths to advance. For his action, the lieutenant was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The failure of their counterattack caused the Japanese to flee eastward. As they pulled out of their strong points, they were mowed down by American machine gun fire, rifle fire, and hand grenades. Following the elimination of the enemy strong points on their front, the 2/8ths moved forward to the end of the airfield. There they halted the attack and dug in for the night. In the interim, the 3/6ths had landed on Green Beach late in the morning. By 17 o'clock, the battalion, following the route of Jones's battalion, halted approximately 600 yards behind the 1/6th and remained there in support. Thus, with the exception of the enemy pocket between Red 1 and Red 2, by evening of the 22nd of November, the Japanese had been driven back to that portion of the island known as Betio's Tail. Julian Smith, who had established his headquarters ashore during the day, still felt that days of fighting lay ahead. He sent the following report to Admiral Turner. Progress slow and extremely costly. Complete occupation will take at least 5 more days. During the night of the 22nd, the Japanese played into American hands by staging more counterattacks. At 19:30, some 50 enemy soldiers began infiltrating the Marines' lines. These were swiftly eliminated. At 23 o'clock, more Japanese left their positions and advanced. The Marines used machine guns, grenades, and mortars to beat off this attack. At 3 o'clock, and again an hour later, hundreds of Japanese troops charged the American lines. By 5 o'clock, it was all over. The counterattacks were smashed and countless Japanese bodies littered the landscape. On D+3, the 2nd Division still faced 2 major tasks: the elimination of the Japanese pocket between Red 1 and Red 2, and the elimination of resistance on Betio's Tail. The 3 halves and 1/8 were given the job of reducing the pocket between the beaches while the 6th Marines struck for the tail. The 3/6ths Battalion Commander, Major McLeod, commented on the drive into the tail. At no time was there any determined defensive. I did not use artillery at all and called for naval gunfire for only about 5 minutes, which was all the support used by me. We used flamethrowers and could have used more. Medium tanks were excellent. My light tanks did not fire a shot. Shortly after 13 o'clock, the 3/6ths reached the eastern tip of Betio, thus securing the island. The final push had cost the Marines 9 lives and 25 wounded. In turn, they managed to annihilate 475 of the enemy while capturing 14. The Japanese were simply too tired, thirsty, and disorganized to put up a coordinated defense. Though they were not lacking in spirit and physical courage, exhaustion took its toll, and their supplies had simply run out. That afternoon also saw the elimination of the enemy pocket between Red 1 and Red 2. Of the 4,836 Japanese troops and Korean laborers who had defended Betio, only 146 were taken prisoner. Of these, only 17 were Japanese. On the American side, 51 Marine officers were annihilated, 853 enlisted men, 2 naval officers and 28 sailors for a total of 934 American dead. 92 Marines later died of their wounds, bringing the total to 1,026. A total of 2,292 Marines and naval personnel were wounded. 88 men were officially listed as missing. The entire cost to the Americans of capturing Betio was 3,406 casualties. Betio itself was a shambles. The ferocity of the battle, which had been fought at such close quarters, was by far the worst yet encountered by the Americans. The smell on the island was suffocating. The scene was apocalyptic. When word of the excessive casualties hit the newspapers in America, Admiral Nimitz came in for a great deal of criticism. He was flooded with letters, some of them blaming him personally for the death of loved ones. Questions as to Tarawa's value were hotly debated. Was the attack worth the cost? Perhaps a review of the simultaneous fighting on Macon and Apamama will answer these questions. In the early morning hours of the 20th of November, 6,472 attack troops of the 165th Regimental Combat Team began boarding their landing crafts, vehicle, and personnel. While the troops settled into their landing barges, carrier planes struck targets on Butaritari Island. At the same time, the naval support ships began their pre-landing bombardment. The Japanese commander elected to forfeit the beaches, choosing to defend the area around King's Wharf, where he had constructed tank traps and barricades on each flank. It was fortunate indeed for the Americans that the enemy did not contest the beaches because, just as at Betio, the landing vehicles, tracked landed with little trouble, but the landing craft's vehicle personnel were unable to cross the reef. Once more the attackers were forced to wade ashore. If the Japanese had been waiting on the beaches, it would have been a massacre. Around 8:30, the attackers landed and easily secured the western end of Butaritari in just under 2 hours. When the 1st Battalion began to advance toward the western tank trap, however, heavy Japanese resistance was encountered. While the battalions slugged it out with the enemy, General Ralph Smith sent the 2nd Battalion to land on the island's lagoon beach. For most of the first day, the men of the 2nd Battalion battled a determined enemy intent on preventing the landing. As night settled over the battlefield, the stalled 1st Battalion dug in from the western tank trap. During the night, the inexperienced GIs were infiltrated by the Japanese. Trigger-happy American troops shot at anything that moved. This caused Holland Smith's temper to rise. The Americans spent the next day in an effort to reduce the enemy strongpoints. Again, as at Betio, they found that the flamethrower and the satchel charge were the most valuable weapons. Progress was slow, much too slow for the liking of Holland Smith. On the 23rd, the 3rd Battalion, which had also come ashore on day but had spent the next 2 days in reserve, spearheaded the main American attack. After crossing the eastern tank trap, the battalion moved steadily forward against the Japanese positions. At nightfall, the Japanese again infiltrated the American lines and attacked in small groups, but to no avail. By the evening of the 23rd, Ralph Smith signaled Admiral Turner that the island was captured. To eliminate Macon, the Americans suffered 218 casualties, 66 of whom were annihilated. The enemy lost 445 dead. It was the Navy that incurred the greatest loss of life at Macon. The Japanese submarine I-175 torpedoed the escort carrier Liscum Bay. A total of 644 of the carrier's crew were lost. The loss of the Liscum Bay was proof positive that amphibious attacks had to be swift, thereby allowing the fleet freedom to roam. The naval aviators ranted against Spruance for retaining the carriers in support of land targets. Holland Smith, however, placed the blame elsewhere, on the 27th Infantry Division. He later stated that the capture of Macon was infuriating slow. Considering the size of the atoll, the nature of the enemy's defenses, and the great superiority of force enjoyed by the attackers, the capture of the target should have been accomplished much faster. Smith was not finished with his castigation of the hapless 27th Division. This was merely the beginning of a storm that would later burst in all its fury at Saipan. The third target in the Gilberts was Apamama. A reconnaissance force landed there on the 21st of November and found only a handful of Japanese. By the time the island was secure, 2 Marines were dead and 2 more wounded. In all, 25 Japanese were annihilated on Apamama, 18 by their own hands. Believing that suicide was more honorable than surrender, they annihilated themselves. Operation Galvanic was over. To the 2nd Marine Division, the experience at Tarawa was a horrible nightmare. On the 4th of December, Julian Smith turned command of Tarawa over to the Navy, and the 2nd Marines sailed to their new base, Camp Tarawa in Hawaii.